good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on what part of the globe you join us today from. I am Sandeepan, Director at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, and on behalf of the Foundation, let me welcome you all to this Young Scholars Online Seminar Series 2022-23. Foundation, or FAS as most of you would know, is a not-for-profit research organization based in India and established in 2003. Its major objective is to facilitate multidisciplinary theoretical and empirical inquiry in the field of agrarian studies in India and elsewhere in less developed countries. We do so in association with a wide section of people interested in the agrarian question, including persons associated with academic institutions, members of mass organizations working in the countryside, and other professionals and scholars. Since 2005, a major activity of the Foundation has been an India-wide program of village studies titled the Project on Agrarian Relations in India. The program involves description and analysis and the creation of a detailed database on village India in diverse agroecological and socioeconomic regions in the country. 27 villages covering a wide range of different agroclimatic regions across 12 states of India have been surveyed as part of the program. Drawing on this unique data archive and follow-up studies, the Foundation has attempted to take up key research questions of the rural economy, including the situation of Dalit households, the socioeconomic characteristics of small farmers, issues in women's employment, to name just a few. The findings of these studies are regularly published as part of a socioeconomic survey series and as an agrarian studies series. FAS also publishes a peer-reviewed journal of international repute, Review of Agrarian Studies. It is an open source journal, and I would urge you all to visit the journal at www.ras.org.in. I would not be wrong to say that it is a critical resource for academics interested in rural societies, rural economies, and histories. In addition, we also conduct regular academic events to disseminate our research activities to the wider academic community, peasants and agricultural workers organizations, and women's associations. We have a long history of working with young scholars through different platforms. Whenever feasible, we have supported the research of MPhil and PhD scholars who are interested in the field of agrarian studies and different socioeconomic aspects of rural life in India. We invite doctoral and postdoctoral students to come and work on a large database based on primary data on rural India. Make use of our method and our database and other resources which are mostly open source. We also have a library focusing on agrarian studies located in Thrissur, Kerala, with a collection of more than 10,000 books and reports, and we would be happy to see young researchers visit us and work there. In the pre-COVID era, we used to regularly conduct young scholars workshops with the aim of interacting with researchers, discussing the method of village studies and different dimensions of the agrarian question as they have evolved in the recent times. This was also a platform for such scholars to discuss their research ideas with senior scholars and experts in the field. This seminar series is in a sense an attempt to revive that institution that came to a pause during the COVID pandemic, although in an online mode. And we are very fortunate to have with us a set of 9 to 10 scholars who have either recently completed their doctoral studies or are in an advanced stage, who will be presenting their work through the platform of FAS. Their work broadly covers areas including such as agriculture production, agrarian and labor relations, rural economy, caste in rural India, and development of science and technology in agriculture. These seminars will be held once every month, in all probability on the last Thursday of every month. We sincerely hope to learn a lot from these seminars and the discussions that they invoke. We also believe that this will help us build a network of young scholars working on different aspects of the agrarian question in different parts of the globe. And we are most fortunate to have with us Professor Barbara Harris-White, Emeritus Professor of Development Studies at the University of Oxford, as the series chair. Professor Barbara is someone who does not need any introduction in a crowd of students and scholars working on rural political economy, and particularly the political economy of rural India and South Asia. In fact, she was the founder director of Oxford University's Contemporary South Asian Studies program. Let me also introduce our first caller and speaker for the day, Ms. Juhi Chatterjee, who is currently pursuing her PhD from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Juhi is also a project associate at the School of Energy and Environment, National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. Her work focuses on energy use in agriculture. Anjali Sharma, Wellcome Postdoctoral Fellow 2020-21 and a visiting faculty at the Azim Premji University, Bangalore, will be the discussant for this seminar. With this introduction, may I call upon our chair, Professor Barbara, to initiate and moderate the proceedings. In the interest of time and brevity, I suggest all of you in the audience kindly key in your comments and questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and they will be taken up in an interactive session that will follow the presentation. Professor Barbara.
Thank you very much, Sandeepan. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
This is a very happy day for me, and it's a great privilege to chair this online seminar series once a month for at least a year, which testifies to the enthusiasm of a generation of graduate students and young researchers. And it's a privilege to chair the event which brings them together. And I want to thank the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, and in particular, Sandeepan, Tapas, and Sujan, who have helped bring this series to life. And FAS, of course, Foundation has become the preeminent institute for village studies and for agrarian studies in general. And I want to congratulate it. Without more ado, I want to do two things. Firstly, I want to housekeep and explain how the session is going to pan out. And then I want to say a few very, very brief words of introduction about energy and agriculture. So first, the housekeeping. We're going to invite Juhi to present her paper for about half an hour, after which Anjali will discuss the paper for about 5 minutes, and I will also add my comments before opening out to Q&A. The whole session is timed for just over an hour, perhaps up to an hour and a quarter, so the audience has some sense of the time of it. Energy. There is no agriculture without energy. Agriculture can be seen as a production and consumption system for energy. But energy has been a special field. It's been kind of tucked away in ecology and in big models. And it hasn't been central to agrarian studies, although it ought to have been, and it's long overdue. We know that in our lifetimes, all of our lifetimes, no matter how young, you've been witnessing a massive substitution of fossil energy for human and animal energy in agriculture. And energy must be more known about for us to feel more confident about the technology that's necessary for a low carbon transition. So without more ado, I will turn it over to Juhi, because her topic is energy use in agriculture. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Barbara. Let me just show my presentation. Is my screen visible?
It is to be.
Yes, yes, it is visible.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and hello. I would like to thank you all for joining this session today. And I would also like to thank the Foundation for Agrarian Studies for providing me with this opportunity to begin and initiate the Young Scholar Seminar Series, which will be on for another year. I would like to thank Professor Barbara Harris-White for agreeing to chair the session, and looking forward to her comments at the end of the session. I'd also like to thank Dr. Anjali Sharma for agreeing to be a discussant for my presentation today. So as has been mentioned in the introduction to my presentation, my thesis focuses on the energy used in the agricultural sector and will specifically assess the potential for transition to renewable energy sources, specifically focusing on solar energy. So today in my presentation, I will be focusing and trying to contextualize the need for green growth trajectories and sustainable development in terms of energy use in the agricultural sector from the perspective of a developing nation, which also has its own concerns regarding economic growth and development that it has to take. So this slide provides an overview of the outline of my presentation, of what all I'll be covering today. So I'll begin with a small introduction to set the context of what all comes under the ambit of energy use in the agricultural sector and why it is important to undertake such research. Then I'll move on to the broader research area or broader themes that are covered within my doctoral thesis, which include about 3 major parts. I'll summarize the first 2 parts in a brief manner, while I'll focus in more detail on the energy input-output analysis, which is basically an economy-wide input-output analysis that has been carried out to provide an assessment of energy use and emissions in the Indian agriculture. So moving on to providing an introduction and context of why we need to study energy use in the agricultural sector. Firstly, there is an increasing focus on the abatement of emissions in the AFOLO sector as defined by the IPCC, which includes the agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And even in the more recent literature that is coming, especially from developed countries, as well as the latest version of the 6th assessment report, which came out just last month, there has been a renewed focus on the mitigation potential that the AFOLO sector has, based on the presumption that it is easier to abate in the AFOLO sector, as well as it seems to be more cost effective to do it, especially in developing nations, in comparison to other sectors of the economy. And this has been highlighted specifically in the 6th assessment report, where they've made such sweeping statements like I've mentioned here, which talks about agricultural and forest products and the substitute and its potential to substitute fossil fuels and GHG intensive materials in all sectors of the economy, without actually going into details of how much it would cost to undertake such a potential transition and how it would impact sectors of the economy. So this focus creates an increased pressure, especially on developing nations, which are predominantly agrarian, to actually undertake climate mitigation, the agricultural sector today. While it is becoming increasingly necessary to do so, perspective of being nations must acknowledge that
Can you hear?
Hello?
Juhi? Hello?
Yeah?
We can't
Yeah?
hear you, Juhi.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
for about 20 seconds, you were not audible. You have to
Okay.
repeat.
Yeah, I think there's some bandwidth issue. Maybe I'll try switching off my video.
It's working right now, Juhi, I think.
Yeah, now
It's
it's
working?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So as I was saying, while with the impending threat of climate change, it becomes important to assess the need for sustainable trajectories of growth, explore of low carbon development, and tackling climate change sustained manner. It also is important in contrast when possible being nation, and also look at it in terms of for increasing consumption and productive capacity, especially in developing nations.
Juhi, sorry to intervene.
Yeah.
Perhaps it is better if you switch off your camera.
Okay.
There is a
Okay.
lag that we are experiencing.
Sure. 1 second.
Juhi?
Yeah.
Yeah, her video
Sorry.
is shut off. It's not a problem.
Yeah, okay. Your video
It's
is off
shut off
now.
now, right?
Yes, yes. You can
Okay.
continue.
Sorry. Yeah. So as I was saying, there is a need for exploring the sustainable trajectories of growth, and the potential for low carbon development that should be undertaken, talking about tackling climate change sustained manner. And this would necessitate an endeavor towards promoting and undertaking some and induce some leapfrogging in terms of the current type of technology being used. This would entail introduction of renewable sources of and clean sources of energy, most prominent amongst which includes solar. Specifically in the case of the agricultural sector, this would entail looking at and exploring the possibility of utilizing solar concepts for irrigation, as they are supposed to hold promise of provision of accessible as well as customizable energy solutions, especially in areas where there is a lesser access to reliable sources of electricity for quality in rural areas. Thus, keeping in mind this broader context, we need to assess the possibility abatement of CO2 emissions can be reasonably achieved while also keeping in mind the developmental priorities that we might have as developing nation in terms of increasing per capita energy use, our levels of consumption, well as to enhance productive capacities. So the following slide provides an overview of global emissions in the agricultural sector. So this data has been taken the latest version of the sixth assessment report, where it writes that the AFOLO, which is the agricultural, forestry, and land use sector, globally accounts for 22% emissions, all countries taken together. When we look at similar data for India, we see, so this data is based on the third biennial update report, which was submitted by the Government of India in 2021 to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is an overview emissions highlighting that about 14% of the total GHG emissions taken in the Indian economy were the agricultural sector. So moving on to focus of an overview of the three major research and study areas which have been covered in my thesis, which include the following. So firstly, undertaken an analysis of solar irrigation in Uttar Pradesh, where we evaluated the intervention where a solar irrigation pump set was set up in 2 villages. The second study area, which was undertaken as part of my thesis, included an analysis of impact of irrigation as the ownership of means of irrigation in the Kalyan Karnataka region, which is in northern Karnataka, which is highly arid and dry and is predominantly dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So today, I will primarily be focusing on the third part of my research, which includes an economy-wide input-output analysis, renewable energy sources, and evaluates the potential for abatement of agricultural emissions. So just to provide an overview of the first two parts, begin with the analysis of solar irrigation in Uttar Pradesh. So this study was conducted in 2 villages, Choli and Pur, which were chosen study areas because an intervention was undertaken by a private entity to set up a solar mini grid there of the capacity of 38.4 kilowatt peak. So this mini grid was set up for the provision of electrification as well as for provision of water for irrigation by the means of solar pump sets, which were set across adjoining areas and adjoining villages. So the main focus of this intervention, according to the organization which undertook it, was to actually focus on small and marginal farmers to ensure that these farmers were able to advantage of certain enabling policies provided by the vision of sure sources of irrigation to lead to reduction in their production costs as well as to lead to improvement of their incomes. So the economic model on which this intervention was based included a pay-per-use model where cultivators rent the solar pump set on the basis of an hourly tariff of 120 rupees per hour. This is just to provide an overview of the different systems of irrigation, specifically groundwater irrigation, which are prevalent in the study villages, are based on the sources and various combinations of sources which are used as fuels for running IPSS. So the four major categories sources of irrigation include electric pump sets, diesel pump sets, and a combination of diesel plus solar pump sets, as well as a combination of diesel plus electric pump sets. As was seen the results of our study, the solar pump set was not able to entirely substitute consumption of diesel, but was only able to complement availability of diesel pump sets in the region. I'll just provide a short summary of one of the findings that we had from this study. So this study was actually based on the primary data collection, which was did using the FAS survey schedule, along with a short energy survey, which included questions which explored the ownership of means of irrigation in the region, as well as the kinds and sizes of pump sets that were being utilized, as the hours of under irrigation in various seasons. So the study findings indicate that the study villages already had a high area under irrigation, and hence the impact of the solar intervention was not really too perceptible, especially on the gross area under irrigation. The study villages had already been cultivating water-intensive crops such as paddy and wheat. Hence, visible scope transition towards intensive crops as well as increasing crop diversity in the region was seen to be limited based on the impact evaluation undertook as part of our study. Outcomes of the study also indicate that economic feasibility remains the most prohibitive factor that impacted the adoption of solar irrigation in the region, especially for marginal and small farmers who were largely diverse and lacked the capacity to access financial institutions, the able to bear the high risk, the demand for collateral, as well as the transaction costs associated undertaking such a transition. Another major finding which we got from our study was amount of land operated on by the farmers became a major element of the efficacy of the intervention project in terms of reduction of cost. So for example, for large farmers who accessed the solar irrigation scheme, there was seen to be some reduction in the cost of irrigation. This could scale the cost of irrigation on larger pieces of land, whereas for small and marginal farmers, this did not really create any perceptible impact in terms of reduction in their costs. Moving on to the second research or study area that undertaken as part of my thesis. This included a study conducted in the Kalyan, Karnataka region, including a survey of 10 villages located across different agroclimatic zones, was the two districts of Bidar and Raipur. So this study was undertaken with some of my colleagues from NIAS, where we designed a survey schedule which covered aspects, status and ownership of irrigation, details of agricultural productivity and cropping patterns, the status of agro-meteorological services in the region, as well as the availability of drinking water in the region. So as part of this study, one aspect that we are currently working on along with colleagues of mine include study which provides an analysis of the groundwater level as well as the seasonal variations in groundwater levels in the region to assess the potential for solar irrigation which might be feasible in the region. This This analysis includes identification of parameters which would actually influence the feasibility and possibility of implementing solar in the region. Includes an analysis of certain factors such as seasonal variations in the groundwater level, the cost effectiveness of setting up a solar pump set in the region, the regulatory structure or the availability of subsidies which is available from the government, as well as the availability of land that would be required to set up solar modules depending on different sizes of the pumps. So just to provide a representation of how we are able to identify sites where different models of solar pump sets might work, looked at the prevalent groundwater levels that are available in the region from looking at data of the Central Groundwater Board. And once we could identify the maximum head that a solar set could produce based on the current groundwater levels, and based on the current efficiencies of solar pump sets, we are now trying to analyze what models of solar pump sets would work in different areas, the Kalyan Karnataka region. So this is part of ongoing work which I currently involved in. So to provide a summary of the analysis that was undertaken with Kalyan Karnataka region, see that indicates that surface irrigation was predominant in the study region, with canal irrigation being predominantly utilized by all classes of farmers. The ownership of the means of irrigation in the region also varied with the social and economic status of the cultivators. See that marginal cultivators predominantly owned dug wells and open wells, while semi-medium large farmers owned a higher proportion of deep tube wells in the region. We also see, based on groundwater level data and a depth of wells data that we collected in the study area, that there exists a significant difference in the present and original depth of wells, the reduction in groundwater levels in the region. Also, this to the fact that apart from the expansion of infrastructure irrigation, there are other agricultural food policies which also become imperative yields crops in the region, in which would provided together the basket along with the expansion of irrigation. Moving on now to the third part of my thesis, which involves economy-wide analysis, shift to renewable energy, and the potential for abatement of emission on the basis of an economy-wide input-output analysis, which was undertaken for the Indian economy. To provide a background of what fails as energy use in the agricultural sector, we see that agriculture requires energy inputs all stages of agricultural production, which include use of energy, the form of mechanized implements and machinery during provision of irrigation, other crop operation. Agriculture also utilizes indirect or embedded energy consumption in the form of the pesticides, chemicals, which are utilized during production processes, as well as from embedded energy also other services that the agricultural sector undertakes, such as transport, trade, access, financial services, etc. So with things threat of climate change, there seems to be an increasing focus on green growth, sustainability of energy transition in the agricultural sector, as it's true of all other sectors of the economy. In the agricultural sector, main focus is on the substitution of conventional sources renewable sources of energy, primarily solar energy as a sector, with various discoms all over India trying to convert all of their agricultural to solar. The government has also introduced various policies and regulatory frameworks which promote this new solar energy, the provision of irrigation. More specifically, the form of the PM Kusum scheme, which has been launched recently. But this transition to solar energy should be kept in mind. This entails an increase in the mechanization of culture and increased use of fertilizers and pesticides. It becomes imperative to undertake such an energy analysis of agricultural sector to assess the interlinkages which exist between energy use and how changes in consumption of various inputs as well as changing patterns would affect agrarian economy such as ours. So the following slide provides an example or an overview of kind of sources energy that are utilized by the agricultural sector. So there are two sources of energy which are utilized, including primary energy as well as secondary energy. So primary energy consists of all fuels which can be mined or harnessed directly and are naturally occurring abundantly. Some examples of primary sources as indicated include natural gas, coal, biomass, solar radiation, as well as wind. In terms of secondary energy, these include resources that have been converted or need to be mined or harvested and are not occurring in nature. For example, electricity and petroleum products, the extracted from primary fuels such as natural gas and crude oil. The primary sources of energy such as electricity and petroleum products are directly utilized in agriculture as direct sources of energy for operating farm machinery, mechanized equipment, and other cotton crop operations such as drying, wetting, etc. While primary sources of energy form indirect sources of energy consumption, the agricultural sector, utilized in the production of various inputs that go into the agricultural sector, such as pesticides, fertilizers, besides, and also in the form of other services such as trade, transport, etc. Slide provides an overview and reiterates the research objectives of my thesis, which include estimation of direct, indirect energy consumption for the agricultural sector as well as for various crops. It also includes an estimation of direct and indirect emissions from the agricultural sector, as well as the evaluation of potential for reduction of agricultural emissions. So the two major databases formed exogenous inputs to this analysis include the input-output table of 2015 for DIA, which is constructed by Professor M.R. Silucha, Shivamani and Chadha. It was well along with Brookings institution. So it consists of a 131 sector table, includes data on 5 energy sectors, which are coal and lignite, crude oil, natural gas, petroleum products, as well as electricity. So all the fractional values is this input-output table as it's the commodity into industry table are given in lakhs of rupees or in monetary terms. So the other major data that was utilized externally sourced was database on gross value added, which is available with the monthly, was utilized for the time period of 2011 to 2019. So To provide a brief overview of the methodology that was used for the estimation of direct and indirect energy in the agricultural sector, the first step involved extracting the in that went into the agricultural sector from other sectors of the economy. This was followed by the calculation of percentage contribution of each input, was then ordered. Once we had the contribution possible from sector, this was followed by an analysis of direct energy use that estimated looking at primary and secondary energy sources so directly used as inputs. Since the input-output table gave us data in monetary terms, conversion factors were to convert of input-output in rupees to energy terms. Coefficients were also calculated, putting the share of energy used by indirect inputs into agriculture, while letting the share of fertilizer used unit of agricultural input. This was then multiplied with the energy per unit of fertilizer output to actually get an estimate the indirect energy use assumed in the agricultural sector. The other important methodology or framework that was used in this was the projection of an IO table for 2030. So we used the input-output table of 2015 as a basis to project the gross value added by each sector in 2030, followed by a series of calculations of price coefficients as well as production coefficients, which were then utilized to estimate the final demand, which would be labeled for 2030, following which this was used to estimate a projected IO 2030. This was based the assumption that the ratio of F by GV, which is basically final demand on gross value added by each sector, is assumed to be constant in 2015 to 2030. Once we got the tentative input table for 2030, we made certain adjustments and checks to ensure and just the values of the F by GV ratio to get the final version of the input-output table for 2030, which was then followed by an estimation of direct and indirect energy use and emissions in the year 2030 from the IOD. Provide an assessment of the energy use and emissions undertaken in the agricultural sector across time periods of 2015, 2030.
Juhi, I don't want
Yeah.
to interrupt because this is so interesting, but just to tell you, you've got
Yes.
about 5 minutes.
Okay, oh, fine. I'll just rush through. Okay, so the following slides now provide an overview of the direct and indirect energy use prevalent in the agricultural sector. As is seen from these slides, direct energy utilization in the agricultural sector formed only a minor portion of the total energy which was utilized both in 2015 and 2030. So we split the percentage contribution of direct emissions, which was only seen to be about 0.04% in 2015, which rose to about 0.05 to 0.06% when we projected the values for 2050. So this is just a representation of the indirect energy use, which was seen across different sectors, which acted as inputs to agriculture. This shows that primary sources of indirect energy, the agricultural sector included trade, land transport, fertilizers, pesticides, plus construction and construction services, as well as financial services. So moving on to the calculation of direct and indirect emissions in the agricultural sector, which was the consequence of the estimation of direct and indirect energy. See that again, based on the findings of energy consumption, direct emissions from energy actually form a very small proportion in the total emissions that are occurring from the agricultural sector. I'll just skip these slides and I'll move on to the crop-wise variations in energy use and emissions, which I'm presenting for the following 3 crops. This is from the following analysis that there is also a wide variation in the kinds of direct and energy utilization across various crops which are taken. So as it seems counterintuitive to me, but as I've seen the results of the analysis, that sugarcane actually consumes lesser indirect energy in comparison to paddy and wheat. Similarly, in the case of indirect indirect emissions, which are provided in per tons of output, it's seen that paddy and wheat undertake direct and indirect emissions in comparison to sugarcane. So the last slide, which I would want to focus on, includes the several scenarios that we had built future of 2030 to actually calculate the possible reduction in emissions was possible. So we feel that they assess the potential for emissions reduction. The following 3 scenarios were built on the basis of utilization of 3 different emission factors which were taken from various studies to estimate the energy and emission. So direct and indirect emission consumption of in the agricultural sector can only be theoretically reduced in the following inputs to agriculture. Only realistic possibility of reducing emission includes the direct and indirect consumption of electricity through the deployment of solar pumping. While converting indirect electricity consumption across other sectors such as fertilizers, pesticides, and other services which are employed by the agricultural sector is hard to abate as it involves huge quantums of energy utilization, which might not be readily substitutable. Also, the replacement and substitution of petroleum products with electricity as well as biomass-based fuels and biodiesel is currently not available. There are certain studies such as the Terry and Shell study of 2021, which have actually spoken about a transition away from petroleum. They talk about actually 100% transition, renewable transition possible in the agricultural sector. But in our opinion, it does not seem to be feasible as at the current scales of production and also the current costs associated with the following technology. So as is seen from the table, the results of these different varying emission factors that have been utilized. So the first column, the emission factor, which is currently utilized for India, which is 0.96. If we compare that to the baseline emission scenario that was built for our study, we see that only a 2% change in total emissions is possible. And these varying emission factors are also based on different assumptions of energy generation from renewable energy sources. So for example, if you look at the last column, which uses an emission factor of 0.56, which is actually the emission factor of Brazil, which has a higher share of hydropower, you see that even if India wishes to achieve an energy mix which has a higher proportion of renewable energy sources in it, the possible abatement is only with 18% reduction of CO2 emissions. Just to provide a quick overview of the conclusions that I've linked from my study. So from the analysis that we have undertaken in our three major research areas, we see that direct energy use in agricultural sector is actually very low. There is, instead of talking about a transition towards renewable energy sources, we actually need to be talking about increasing energy supply and increasing consumption levels in the agricultural sector. There needs to be a focus on actually enhancing agricultural productivity and increasing and expanding the irrigation infrastructure, mechanization levels to various crop operations. Also see that majority of the total energy use possible through indirect consumption includes dependent sources such as natural gas, crude oil, and coal, which at current levels of technology and current levels of deployment and cost are not really easily replaceable. Hence, the agriculture sector or the AFLO sector, which was deemed as an easy to abate sector, in reality is not the case. So looking at variations in direct and indirect energy consumption across crops, we also see with possible changes in the cropping patterns, increases in economic activity, as well as in patterns of energy utilization in the agricultural sector, the energy consumption trends will also change. Hence, there is a need for estimating the energy use for individual crops. Use these interlinkages to actually inform policy making. For example, in the future, if we want to reduce energy consumption, we might be able to design a particular cropping pattern which takes into account lesser energy intensive crops while also not compromising the security as well as the need for increasing productivity in agriculture. The last conclusion that I wanted to highlight was that the agricultural sector, instead of being a focus or a site for climate mitigation, should actually be focusing the need for adaptation. The increasing vulnerability in the agricultural sector, changing in terms of increasing climate exchange, there is a need talking about need for adaptation in the agricultural sector and shifting the focus of energy transitions and climate mitigation onto other sectors of the economy. This increasing focus on climate mitigation in the agricultural sector disregards the emissions from energy and industry, especially from the developed nations of the world, as well as from other more emitting economies sector, including industry as well as transport. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juhi. That was extremely ambitious and fascinating. Going from case studies to potential to a whole country analysis. I now want to call on Anjali, who is going to discuss this incredible presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. If I'm audible fine, then I'll keep my video on. Is this okay?
Yeah, you're audible.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So firstly, I'd like to thank Juhi for presenting her thesis work, carefully done and in such detail. So thanks for that. I mainly work in the field of energy, and listening to her presentation, I felt that the work done by Juhi in the context of agriculture sector holds important lessons that can improve our decision making and hopefully policy making about climate and energy policies for India and maybe more broadly. So I want to basically highlight 2 points that struck me based on her presentation. And I think how her work on agriculture can relate to these other questions about can or what role the agricultural sector play in climate mitigation. So with regard to that, I think I would like to highlight 2 main points, which I felt were brought out very clearly by Juhi in her presentation. So the first question is that if we are thinking about climate mitigation, we would want effective policies. And what I have found particularly interesting from Juhi's presentation, especially from her third essay, which was an all India-based economy-wide input-output analysis, what she found was very interesting, that majority, like a big majority of the energy that is used by the agriculture sector is actually indirect energy. So what that means is that, yes, we are using energy for processes that are used for production of crops, etc. But actually that energy is being used to produce other things in other sectors. We need fertilizers, we need pesticides, we need to produce equipment which then can be used for agricultural processes. And it's actually these things which make up for majority of the climate emissions, which then get associated with the agricultural sector. So if we really are thinking of effective policies for decarbonizing our entire economy, just asking to decarbonize agricultural sector will not be enough, and it will actually be counterproductive. India has small and marginal farmers. If they are not the big users of energy, whatever energy is being used in the sector is probably being done in the form of the inputs that they are using. But they can't really change the emissions for how those inputs are produced. So that's why I feel that the focus then should be on these indirect energy sources and how we can decarbonize those sources. So Juhi listed that majority of the energy goes for pesticide production or fertilizer production and also transport sector. So this basically in the energy world is clubbed under industrial emissions and transport emissions. So it's actually not the emissions from agricultural sector per se, but actually the other sectors. And the policies and the strategies we would need would be to basically decarbonize the industries and the transport sector. And as someone who's been working on energy for some time, I do feel that the progress for decarbonizing industrial processes particularly is difficult. And that's why it's partly because of that, it's also been slow. And in terms of transport, our focus has mainly been on, or the research even has focused so much on electric cars that we are not really thinking about other modes of transportation, which could be like combines, tractors, which are anyway more difficult to decarbonize also. So it's not that we have the solutions right now. These things do take time. But I think Juhi's work puts into perspective in terms of what are the sectors and the technologies that we should be focusing on when we are talking about decarbonization. So this is about making effective policies, and I think Juhi's work really makes us think about that. And the second thing, which I feel draws very directly from her work, is that once we have identified clearly and hopefully correctly that what are the sources or processes which are leading to these carbon emissions, it becomes clear that we should not be focusing on farmers to do this or that, because we need to target these specific industrial and transport processes if you're talking about decarbonizing agricultural associated emissions in a significant way or in a large scale. So I feel that her work then also kind of highlights this point that the blame or the burden for decarbonization should be accounted for in a correct manner and in a just manner. And if we put the whole burden on decarbonization on the agriculture sector, which without thinking about industries or transportation, we are unjustly burdening the farmers to decarbonize a sector through activities which don't really hold a lot of potential, because the things that they are doing are not that carbon intensive in the first place. So we are not only then going for a bad policy design, but also an unjust policy design. So I think these two are very important points, my takeaways from her work. And it also then puts into put into my head the thought that we can work on many other things based on the methodologies and the field work that she has done. So there is data already about what are the costs of irrigation through solar pumps. And we have data and knowledge about how much it costs in the conventional way, what is being done currently in terms of the energy costs for farmers. And if we are thinking of transition to solar, there will be cost implications. So Juhi, for example, mentioned that on contract basis, farmers are paying somewhere around rupees 120 per hour. So if we want to see that the changes in costs for these sort of inputs or irrigation can have an impact on how much money the farmers are eventually left with, say, as the take-home wages or the remaining wages after taking into account all the money that they have spent on their inputs. And having done some work on input-output tables, I think that they provide a solid methodology through which we can think and estimate the impact of such large-scale economy-wide changes and see that under different scenarios, how people's employment will be affected or how their wages will be affected. So the scenario analysis which you presented in terms of the implications of different energy sources and their final emissions implications, I think we can extend that even further in an input-output framework by including employment factors or social accounting matrices, and see that how would the wages be affected? How would the economies directly in agriculture or maybe indirectly in other sectors be impacted as we decarbonize the sector with different scenarios? So I think I'll just end by saying that it is, Juhi's work has shown that this is a very important task to look at the social and economic implications of decarbonizing different sectors, particularly agriculture, where I feel very limited empirical work has been done. And we do need to do it to ensure that climate policies do not end up burdening people, especially those policies which may hold very limited success rate in terms of decarbonizing our economy. So I'll again thank Juhi and thank FAS and congratulate them on organizing these seminar series. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anjali. Three comments with which I agree. I now have a few moments to add mine to the stew. I want to congratulate Juhi on opening up an amazingly strong new result, which has huge implications for how we conceive agriculture, how we conceive technical change. My notes are pretty chaotic and messy because I keep adding to them, but let me start with her start, which is the case study. In the end, what she shows through a cost-benefit approach is that solar pumping is it's insignificant in the greater scheme of things, and it's not feasible right now. Anjali has suggested not just using cost-benefit methodologies, but also social accounts. And I would want to add multi-criteria mapping into this frame, which is a consultative, participative, quite rigorous method, which we also used for a solar pump case study. In a multi-criteria mapping, you have to specify your criteria. And for us, it was reducing greenhouse gases, labor, employment, and cost of production. And like Juhi, we found it wasn't really economically feasible. And I wanted to ask her whether in her case study region, there are upfront subsidies for this technology, because the capital costs relative to the maintenance costs are very high. And mostly for small farmers, there were huge non-trivial collective action problems. And I wondered how that came up, or whether it came up in her field research. I want to add a point that if we are generally looking at options to mitigate or to adapt agriculture to the ecological crisis, There is a non-trivial problem with information. I spent months and months trying to find a set of technologies which fulfill those three criteria: greenhouse gases, labour and costs. And what I found, and open to discussion, is that property rights and patents actually affect the availability of information about technology. The ICAR only publishes its own inventions. CGIAR the same. A lot of inventions are frankly private. So it's extremely difficult to get the information about those technologies, which Juhi's work has now shown are probably far less important than the major result, which is the indirect input of energy into agriculture. And I want to turn to that and probably stop there, although I've got lots and lots of questions. Firstly, this is a huge, massive, surprising result that the direct energy inputs to agriculture are so small compared with the indirect ones. And then the other aspect of this double surprise is that the composition of those indirect inputs of energy to agriculture are so weird. In particular, there's a very crowded slide that she showed, which is hard to take in, but what it shows is that the category of other is something like 2/3 of all the indirect inputs of energy to agriculture. Now, when something like that happens, we have to think, how on earth was other classified? What does other include? And I just wondered whether other includes the water, the irrigation infrastructure and other kinds of infrastructure, because another surprise is that construction is so important. Construction in agriculture, we have to get our minds around this. Trade is the second most important, comes after other. And so this actually generates a whole slew of questions about attribution. How were these other sectors, which we don't associate with agriculture, how are they actually attributed to agriculture and to other sectors of the economy that enable this extraordinary result? We have trade, transport, road and rail, very important, financial services, and tractors and fertilizers and pesticides, upon which much scholarship, many scholarly lives have been devoted, are really quite unimportant in the indirect inputs of energy into agriculture. So I have a load of questions about classifications, about what other means and what it includes. And I'm sure you've had to think about it because it's such an astonishing result. And then I have a 101 question about double counting. We have coal as a sector when we're looking at the sources of energy, but we also have electricity. And we do know that something like 70% of all India's electricity is coming from coal. So I wondered whether coal is being double counted or not. To wind up, I have so many comments. You make a very strong statement that mitigation is in agriculture itself, and I think you backed it up very well, that mitigation is not really the issue, that it's mitigation of sectors outside agriculture, and you throw your hands up in despair and say, we can't do this. But actually, another way of looking at that is that it introduces a much wider range of potential technologies, and which your work can now prioritize in terms of their importance to agriculture. So I would want to turn that conclusion a bit on its head and say, this opens up a massive field of technology, which we don't usually associate with agriculture. And then a final word on adaptation, which is where you end up. And that is that the work of Marcus Taylor has stated very clearly that rather than it being a technical issue, a matter of governance, it's a much broader kind of socio-ecological problem in which human societies produce a natural environment. And I wondered whether, given the theoretical framing of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, that Marcus Taylor view of adaptation being a political, sociological, ecological view rather than confined to technology is worth pursuing. But anyway, thank you very much for a brilliant start to our seminar series. So now we turn to questions and answers, and there are several in the chat box. And using chair's privilege, what I would like to do is not take them in order, but because some of them are very broad and they're not really pertaining to the presentation itself, whereas others are truly about the presentation. And so I would take the final one from Yogeshwari first, which is, could you elaborate on the methodology used to arrive at the use of energy, particularly indirect use? So this is, I think, reinforcing my question about attribution. How did you do it? I expect there are problems about the conversion factors that you were forced to use. Anyway, could you answer that one first, please, Juhi?
Sure, Professor. Thank you for all your comments, which I'll take them into consideration, especially your comments on adaptation. So moving on to the question, even your doubts and Yogeshwari's question on attribution. So for estimation of indirect energy, what we did was we first looked at all the other sectors which provide inputs into the agricultural sectors. For example, if we take, say, fertilizer use, we saw how much of per put production of agricultural crops is the amount of input that is going from the fertilizer sector. Then we had to, since the input output table only provides values in monetary terms, we had to rely on price coefficients to actually convert these values from monetary terms into G terms, or the terms of joules and joules. But the other of attribution that we did was we also looked at the energy consumption within the fertilizer sector. So we looked at what sources of energy in terms of the 5 energy sectors that I spoke about, including electricity, coal, crude oil, natural gas, and petroleum. How much of those energy sources are actually being used by the fertilizer sector? And then try to attribute direct energy estimate, which was for the fertilizer sector, in terms of the proportion of energy that would be utilized to.
Sorry, Juhi, you went on mute.
Yeah, so we try to attribute how of the energy that is utilized by the fertilizer sector is actually utilized in proportion per unit of agricultural output that is being utilized, then input to the fertilizer sector. So we looked at, and yeah, I take your point, Professor, also regarding maybe the possibility of double counting when we talk about utilization of coal as well as the power sector. There might be some overlap with that, but the utilization of coal is also given the sectors, the economy, such as sugars and pesticides, which actually coal directly for their production process. So there is some difference in terms of how that is accounted for in the input-output table. There might be some counting. Coal is also used sector, but input-output table also provides separate data usage for all sectors which act as inputs to the agricultural sector. So yeah, that sort of partly answers the question of attribution, where we looked at the utilization for all other sectors which act as inputs, and then converted these.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, Professor, you were saying something?
Jairam wanted to come in and add some comments about the accounting. Would you like to come in now?
Yes, Professor. And thank you. Such a pleasure to meet you outside of social media comments. Thank you for your remarks. I just want to point out that there are two ways in which emissions are accounted for in relation to goods and services. The one that you see here today is more closely related to what are called life cycle analysis. So if you take a particular product or a particular sector, like say crop production or individual crops, you not only see the emissions which come from growing the crop, the use of fertilizers, etc., etc. Then there is the use of energy in the production of the crop, which then requires, leads to carbon dioxide emissions. But you also include the emissions of all the products and services which are part of the process of producing the crop. Yeah. So defining the boundary is the name of the game, if you wish. The IPCC system of accounting, however, has 4 or 6 specified sectors and subsectors, and quite obviously for good reasons, which are somewhat obvious, they avoid double counting. They are specifically designed to avoid double counting. Now, unfortunately, this whole question of who is to bear the burden when agriculture becomes something of a whipping boy for emissions. So very often you find statements about how agriculture is, if agriculture were a country, it will be the 3rd largest emitter, or something like that. But you could say that about automobiles. Yeah. Nobody presents similar figures for automobiles that include the steel. They have to run on roads. So I suppose you could put in all of road construction, highway construction. And so if you take everything that an automobile utilizes for its functioning or for the use of automobiles, then it would be a truly a large number. So there is a political issue here, I think, it's very odd that you tell the small farmer that, oh, your urea is creating so many emissions, but you don't tell the guy who drives the Mercedes that, that his steel in his car is contributing so much. So this accounting has to be, you have to distinguish the context. And one has to be quite careful. Just one last comment, not directly related, with your permission. I think the difference between the traditional view of adaptation on the left, if I may say so, as a political, social, and economic problem, and not purely technological, is, I think, quite different from Marcus Taylor's view. Marcus Taylor comes, I think, from the angle of political ecology, where somehow political thought or political views directly influence one's ecological perceptions, if you wish, but unmediated by technology, social institutions, other structures. They sort of don't make an appearance. So I think there would be a lot of us who would say that, yes, adaptation is very much a political, socio-economic problem alongside the technological. But nevertheless, we might not quite buy into Marcus Taylor's argument. Thank you. I'll stop here. Sorry for the time.
Thank you, Professor Jairam, and that's very well taken. May I now go to the questions in the chat, which are on broader issues? Do you mind trying to parry these, Juhi? The first one comes from IIT Mumbai. I'm not quite sure from whom, but is asking you, have you looked at emissions produced, I think this is in life cycle terms, for manufacturing solar energy systems that are useful for electrification, irrigation, in other words, much wider uses in agriculture. Do you have a view on that, or do you think it's outside the scope of your work? Can you see the...
Yes, sir. Sorry, Professor, continue.
No, can you see the question?
Yeah, I can see the question. So one thing related to the question on accounting, or actually accounting for life cycle assessments during production of solar equipment, is that so the input-output table, since provides an overview of an output economy, it does take into account the production, the sort of energy use, or at least in value terms, the commodities.
I think, am I the only person who can't hear?
Hello, am I audible now?
Hello, yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, so I was saying that in terms of production processes, the accounting cycle assessment, including production, it will be put for in the input-output table. Although sadly, what I had planned and wanted to do was that the input-output table in the current form does not give a disaggregated breakup of the power sector in terms of renewable sources of energy versus conventional sources. So everything is included within the electricity sector. So doing that separately for solar might not be possible unless we actually utilize frameworks to disaggregate that, or manage to get some other additional data from other input-output databases that are available, which can be complemented along with our input-output table. But broadly within the power sector and the electricity sector, the production processes would be included and subsumed. So separating it out in the current form would be difficult, and that is not something that I have looked at currently, but maybe that is something that can be explored
by somebody else. Thank you. Shubhajit J has a question in the chat box about zero budget natural farming, which is a subset of the questions about what kind of options we have in agriculture, which I think you have dealt with in the discussion. Do you want to say anything more about ZBNF, because it is a focus of the government of India?
Yeah, so related to natural, organic, or zero budget farming, I mean, it might lead to a reduction of emissions because it does not really rely on any agricultural inputs. But then we also have to think about the implications that it would have on productivity of different crops. We do have crops which do require, which are water and energy intensive, and thus switching to zero budget natural farming would not allow us to cultivate those crops, affect the security as well as increasing.
Can't hear you, Juhi. Can't hear you, Juhi.
Yeah.
But I think Juhi was saying that it's unlikely to solve India's pressing agricultural problems. And there is a growing literature which is taking the technology apart and showing that it won't maintain yields with the kinds of inputs that are suggested. Sandeepan, how are we off for time?
Yeah, so I think this is the correct point at which I can say that maybe we can take another question or comment, but we are now already past the time. So in case you have some wrapping up comments, Professor, that would be very useful, and then we can move on to the vote of thanks.
There is another question in the chat about carbon trading, but I didn't ask it, Danton, because it's such a huge issue and it's outside Juhi's presentation, but maybe for another time. This has been a terrific first launching pad for the year's seminars, and we're very grateful to you, Juhi. I think that your presentation asks as many questions as it answers, but you are trying to answer some pretty important questions which have been marginalized, especially in agrarian political economy. So thank you very much. The next seminar is Shristi Yadav, whom I think is here somewhere, who's going to be talking on caste, diversification, and the agrarian question. And we look forward to that in a month's time. Thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you, Professor Rosa. As a coordinator of this event, before closing the session, I'd like to take this opportunity to give the vote of thanks. First, I'd like to extend my thanks to the speaker, Juhi, and the discussant, Dr. Anjali Sharma, for the seminar. But I would like to express my thanks to Professor Barbara White, who helped us to conceptualize the program from the initial stage, and she has kindly agreed to chair all the session under this seminar. I also thanks to all the participants for attending this session, and also sincerely hope that you all will be participating in the next all the seminars. I'd like to especially express my thanks to the FAS online team, especially Sujan, Neera, Deepak, Sandipan, Setu, Rakesh from FAS, and Gautam from the Pre-Software Movement Karnataka for conducting this event very smoothly. As before the closing the session that I just already Professor Barbara announced about the next seminar, Dr. Shristi Yadav, who recently completed the PhD from New School and New York, and currently instructor at the Department of Economics in University of Manitoba. She will be speaking on the next seminar, and hope we'll see you soon in the next month, May 26th at the same time, 4:30 p.m. We'll be posting about the upcoming events, more details in the coming weeks. And at the end, I request all the participants here, please follow FAS website, social media accounts in Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to get updates on the work of the FAS. Thank you.